Hi, this is a short video in which I just want to talk for a minute about how to write a summary of an empirical psychology journal article. This is an assignment you'll get all across many different psych classes, especially if you major in psych. You'll get to know this process well, but when it's new to you, it might sound sort of hard to just summarize the entire article out of nowhere, so I want to give you a basic short guide to writing those summaries of empirical journal articles in psych. So when I assign a summary of an article, I usually expect it to be about 5 to 10 sentences long, and it should only really ever be a single paragraph. You can sometimes stretch it into 2 if you're writing a really long summary, but I will almost never assign that in my classes. Your mileage may vary. You should check with your professor. They may differ about how long they want particular summaries to be. If you're ever unsure what their length requirement is, you can ask. And if they want something longer than 5 to 10 sentences, all you have to do is add more detail to each of the sort of 5 major things you need to cover in one of these kind of summaries. And so what are those 5 things? They start with purpose. What is the purpose of the article you're reading or summarizing? What central research question did they ask or start from? This is sort of a really short version of their introduction section. Why does this research need to be done? You could answer any of those 3 questions in a sentence or 2, and then you move on to the next piece, the method. Method is fairly straightforward. Talk about precisely what methodology they used. It can be very different depending on the type of article you're reading, and it can be different levels of detail depending on what you need to say about it. So another thing to think about all through this process is, what is the point of the summary you're writing? Why are you writing it? What are you going to use it for? And so your usage of the method section, your description or summarization of the method section might differ depend on what you're going to need later on when you reread the summary, or when the person reading your summary reads your summary, if that's not you yourself. So you'll usually do something like list the number of people in the study, the N. You'll probably talk a little bit about the measures that they used. You'll provide whatever definitions are necessary, like if you're about to talk about a particularly unique method in the results section, you better define it here before you get there. If they use scales, you'll want to define the scales so that the reader knows. But you don't need to get really deep into any of these things. Single sentences for hopefully only a couple. That way you stick to 1 to 2 sentences for the method section as well. Then move on to results. Third big section, third big item you have to cover in a summary. In this section, it's really crucial to show that you read the paper. This is the kind of thing where you could just kind of restate the results generally based on a really nice quick skim of the abstract. But when you do that, prof can tell because you don't have any detail in there, and when they see it, they're going to ask you for detail. So find the relevant critical statistics. Restate them if you understand how to do that correctly. If you don't, at least try to include some restatement that is more detailed than what you see in the article's own abstract. This part of the task gets easier after you've taken research methods and statistics. Once you've got the results covered, move on to the conclusion. What do those results mean? What do they suggest we should be taking away? In other words, what's the answer to the research question that you posed at the very beginning? And then after that, the last section that not every summary necessarily needs, but I always like to see, is a discussion of implications. So we've got a research question, we've got an answer to a research question, and then of course the method and results in between those two. And then at the end we need to talk about why we should care about that research. Why does it matter that someone asked this research question, particularly if you're looking at basic psychology, or if you're looking in any other STEM field at basic work. It's important to think about why it matters to people in their everyday lives. If you're reading or summarizing a really heavily applied piece of work, then maybe this isn't going to be as complicated a task, but you should always have some kind of statement of the implications of the piece of research you just summarized. And then sometimes you might want to add an opinion or an editorial comment at the very end. So ask your prof if you're not sure whether you should include that. Usually if you need it, it'll be something that they ask you for. So if your assignment doesn't say, I would leave it out, would be my personal advice. But add that in at the end if need be. Make note of maybe a limitation that you find particularly problematic, or talk about where you think the research should go from there, or note some other important thing. In general, you could also note how the paper might fit in to whatever else you're going to use it for. You probably read this paper for a reason. Maybe you're going to present it later. Maybe you're going to include it in a paper you're writing. It's always nice for yourself later on to leave like a bullet point, maybe not that you'll turn in necessarily, but a bullet point that you can see, so that that tells you a little bit about how you think this paper will fit into your eventual paper. Give yourself that kind of note to read later on. Help your future self. And then, of course, the last important thing is to cite. You can't write these things based on nothing. You've written them based on a paper, right? A particular paper. So you should always be citing in text in APA style for a cite course. And usually these summaries are, like I said, are one paragraph. So you'll probably need an in-text citation at the end of the first sentence. Or if you use the author's names in the first sentence, you'll just need an in-text citation of the year after their names. And then you usually don't need to cite it again through the rest of the summary. The general rule of thumb in APA in-text citation is when it's still clear which paper you're talking about, you don't have to cite it again. But if you switch to one other, like let's say you start with the purpose of the paper, and then when you get into the methods, you have to cite a different paper because that's where they got their measure from, then you might need to cite your original paper again when you get back to the results. Or at least talk about the author's names again, put the year in an in-text citation. Whatever works for you. And then, of course, you should probably always have the full APA style reference of the paper immediately after the paragraph, especially if you're turning in the summary as its own thing. I should always cite the place that your work comes from in full. The last issue here is style, and that's a piece where psychologists kind of have their own thing going, like you may have seen if you've taken a psych course before. We tend to use a lot of words that people use every day, but mean them and define them completely differently. So as you start to learn the vernacular of psychology, you're also going to probably get used to the style of writing in psychology, and that's going to change the way you write summary paragraphs over time as well. And there's really no kind of perfect solution or immediate way to learn that difference in style, but as you write more summaries and as you read more summaries and as you get feedback on more summaries throughout time, you'll figure your way into that style. So if your very first one kind of doesn't sound like the ones you're reading, don't fret. Your prof should understand that you're writing some of your first summaries in intro psych or in a 200 level course, and they'll be ready to read those kinds of summaries, and you'll get more into the style. You'll see more of your writing reflecting the reading you're doing as you move on through a psych major. So I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching this short video about summarizing empirical journal articles in psych. See you in the next one.